My son-in-law called me dead weight at the barbecue, then his boss walked in and recognized my name. He said it loud enough for the whole backyard to hear. The old man doesn't do anything anymore. He's dead weight, and everybody's too polite to say it. He was holding a beer in one hand and my daughter's waist in the other, and he was laughing when he said it, like it was a joke I was supposed to laugh at, too. I set my paper plate down on the picnic table very carefully, because my hands wanted to shake and I would not let them. And that was the exact moment a black Audi pulled into the driveway, 30 minutes early, and a man in a golf shirt got out, looked across the yard, and said my name out loud like he'd seen a ghost. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If this pulled you in already, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every one of them. And a quick note before we go further, this story blends real patterns of elder financial abuse with details adapted for storytelling. Names and settings have been changed, but the lesson underneath them is real, and it matters. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. 6 weeks earlier. My name is Walter Hain. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I designed turbine blades for a living. Not the kind you learn about in a classroom in one semester, the kind you spend a career on, the kind where a single millimeter of curvature is the difference between an engine that runs for 40,000 hours and one that doesn't run at all. I retired 4 years ago, the same spring my wife Margaret was diagnosed, and I spent the 18 months after that doing nothing but sitting beside her hospital bed, and then the 2.5 years after that doing nothing much at all. I'm not going to pretend that isn't true. Grief hollows a man out, and I let it. I stopped going to the Engineering Society dinners. I stopped answering half my calls. I let my daughter Jenna and her husband Derek take over more and more of my life, because it was easier than doing it myself, and because some small stubborn part of me believed that letting my son-in-law manage things was a kind of trust one owed him. Jenna is 32. She's the only child Margaret and I ever had, and she has her mother's laugh and her mother's habit of believing the best about people until she's given absolute proof otherwise. She married Derek Cole 4 years ago in a backyard almost exactly like the one I stood in that August afternoon, and I remember standing at that first wedding thinking he seemed decent enough. A little too smooth in his handshake, maybe. A little too quick with a compliment. But decent enough. Derek works, as a project manager at a company called Holbrook Dynamics, a mid-sized aerospace supplier out on the industrial loop outside the city. I never asked too many questions about his job, because whenever I did, he had a way of making the conversation feel like a test I was failing, some jargon I didn't quite follow, some acronym he'd let hang in the air a beat too long before explaining it, slowly, like I was a child. I want to tell you plainly, before I go any further, that I did not go looking for a reason to distrust my son-in-law. I went looking for a burger and a cold soda on a hot Saturday afternoon, because my daughter had invited me to a barbecue at their house to celebrate Derek's 1-year anniversary at Holbrook, and because I loved my daughter and I wanted, more than almost anything, to be the kind of father who shows up. The backyard was full by 4 o'clock. 25 people. Neighbors, a couple of Derek's co-workers, Jenna's book club friends. Somebody had strung up paper lanterns between the fence posts even though it was broad daylight, the way people do when they want a party to feel like an event. I sat in a folding chair near the cooler, drinking a ginger ale, mostly listening, the way I've always done at parties, because 31 years of sitting in engineering review meetings teaches you that the quiet man in the corner usually hears more than the loud one in the middle of the room. Derek had had 4 beers by the time the incident happened. Maybe 5. I wasn't counting on purpose, but I'd noticed, the way you notice things without meaning to. He was standing near the grill with 2 of his co-workers, a younger man named Priya's husband. No, I'm sorry, Priya was the co-worker herself, a woman in her 30s with a sharp laugh, and a heavy-set man named Grant who kept refilling everyone's cups a little too enthusiastically. They were talking about promotions. About who was getting looked at for the operations director role that had opened up when a man named Bill Sorensen retired that spring. "I've got it locked," Derek said. I heard that clearly, because he wasn't trying to keep his voice down. Sorensen liked me. Told me himself before he left. "You've been there what, 5 years?" Priya said. "For and change. But I run point on 3 of our biggest accounts. I don't need seniority. I need results, and I've got results." He took a pull off his beer. "Only thing that ever slowed me down was having to babysit my father-in-law half the time. Jenna's dad." He gestured toward me with the bottle, not even lowering his voice, like I was a piece of lawn furniture that happened to have ears. "Guy used to be some kind of engineer, way back. Now he just sits around. We cover his health insurance gap, we drive him to half his appointments, we do his taxes because he says computers give him a headache. The old man doesn't do anything anymore. He's dead weight, and everybody's too polite to say it." There was a small, uncomfortable laugh from Grant. Priya didn't laugh at all. She glanced over at me, and I watched her face do the thing people's faces do when they realize the person being talked about is sitting 15 feet away holding a paper plate. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering you tonight. It didn't feel like rage. Rage would have been easier. It felt like standing very still at the bottom of something cold. 31 years designing parts that keep airplanes in the sky. 31 years of mortgage payments and orthodontist bills and Margaret's medical debt that I paid down to 0 before she died because I refused to let her spend her last year worrying about money. Dead weight. Said in front of my daughter's friends, at my daughter's house, with my daughter's hand resting on his shoulder like she hadn't heard a word of it, or had heard it so many times before that it no longer registered as unkind. I set my paper plate down on the picnic table. I did not say anything. I have found, over the years, that the moment you feel most compelled to speak is usually the moment you should hold your tongue the longest, because whatever comes out of you in that heat will be smaller and less useful than whatever comes out of you an hour later, once you've thought. And that is the exact moment the black Audi pulled into the driveway. A man got out. 50s, silver hair combed straight back, golf shirt with a small embroidered logo I recognized, the Holbrook Dynamics Falcon insignia, the same one stitched onto the corner of Derek's work polo hanging in his hall closet. The man walked around the side of the house into the backyard the way people do when they've been to a house enough times to know the shortcut, lifted a hand in greeting to the group at large, and then his eyes crossed the yard and landed, of all places, on me. He stopped walking. "Walter Hayne?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like a man confirming a fact he couldn't quite believe. I stood up slowly, the way my knees make me do everything these days. "That's right. The Walter Hayne? W. Hayne Propulsion Systems?" He was already crossing the yard toward me, hand extended, and I watched Derek's face do something complicated, surprise, then confusion, then a kind of scrambling recalculation, like a man watching numbers on a spreadsheet suddenly knotted up. "I hold that patent, yes," I said, shaking his hand. "Have for almost 20 years now." "Good Lord." The man was laughing now, an astonished laugh, shaking his head. "I'm Richard Pruitt. I run Holbrook Dynamics." "Derek's," he glanced toward Derek, who had gone very still by the grill, "Derek's boss. We license 3 of your compressor stage designs. Do you have any idea how much of our Northeast contract runs through your patent family?" He turned back to me, still holding my hand, still shaking his head like he was trying to clear water out of his ears. I sat in a licensing renewal meeting 8 days ago where your name was on every single page of the term sheet. I had no idea you were Derek's father-in-law. Derek never mentioned it. I looked past Richard Pruitt's shoulder at my son-in-law, and for the first time in 4 years, I watched him look genuinely, completely afraid. If you're still with me, drop the word recognized in the comments so I know you caught that moment the way I felt it. Now let me tell you what happened after Richard Pruitt drove away that evening, because that was only the first crack in the foundation. What came underneath it was so much worse than an unkind comment at a barbecue. The week after, Derek did not apologize to me that night. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. He laughed it off in front of his co-workers, small world, hey, Rich, and steered the conversation somewhere else within about 90 seconds, and by the time the last guests left at 9 o'clock, he'd had 2 more beers and seemed to have decided the whole thing was a funny coincidence rather than a humiliation of his own making. Jenna walked me to my car. She hugged me longer than usual. She didn't say anything about what Derek had said, and I didn't bring it up, because I could see in her face that she'd heard it, and I didn't want to make her choose sides in her own driveway. But something had shifted in me that I couldn't undo. I drove home to the house Margaret and I bought in 1994, the house where I'd raised Jenna, the house I still keep her old bedroom exactly as it was because I have never found the strength to change it, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of decaf I didn't drink and I thought about the phrase Derek had used. Dead weight. And I thought about the fact that Richard Pruitt had said my patents accounted for a piece of a contract large enough that he drove out on a Saturday to personally deliver good news about it. And I thought, this is the part I'm not proud of, but I promised you honesty. I thought about how odd it was that Derek, who apparently ran point on major accounts at his company, had never once, in 4 years, mentioned my name to his own boss. That struck me as strange enough that I couldn't let it go. I am, by training and by nature, a man who cannot look at an anomaly and simply walk past it. 31 years of failure analysis teaches you that the detail that doesn't fit the pattern is usually the most important detail in the room. So on Monday morning, I called my accountant. Sal Renner has done my taxes since 2003. He's sharp, careful, and he's the kind of man who reads every line of a document before he signs anything, which is exactly why I trust him. I asked him a simple question. Sal, when's the last time you actually prepared my return? Not reviewed one Derek brought you. Prepared one. There was a pause on the line that told me everything before he said a word. Walter, he said slowly, Derek's been handling your filings directly with a different preparer for the last 2 years. He told me you'd moved your business elsewhere. I assumed you'd cleared it with me. I never cleared anything, I said. I never even discussed it. Another pause. Walter, I think you and I need to sit down. We sat down that Wednesday afternoon in Sal's office, a small suite above a dry cleaner's on Fenmore Street that's been there since before I retired. Sal pulled a folder that had my name on the tab and slid it across the desk, and what was inside made my stomach go tight in a way I hadn't felt since the week Margaret's oncologist called us into his office with a face he was trying too hard to keep neutral. There was a change of preparer form, dated 14 months ago, with a signature on the bottom line that was supposed to be mine. It was close. Close enough that at a glance, in a hurry, you might not notice. But I have signed my name perhaps 40,000 times in my life, on engineering drawings and payroll checks and Margaret's hospital consent forms, and I know the particular hitch in my own capital H, the way it doesn't quite close at the top. This H closed. This wasn't my signature. Sal, I said, I did not sign this. He looked at me for a long moment. I was afraid you were going to say that. We went through the rest of the folder together. A durable power of attorney form, drafted but, thankfully, mercifully, not yet notarized, sitting in Sal's file because Derek had asked him 8 months earlier whether Sal could help walk Walter through some paperwork to simplify things given his age. Sal had refused, politely, on the grounds that this wasn't tax work and he wasn't licensed to notarize legal instruments, and he'd told Derek to see an attorney. He said Derek had seemed unbothered by the refusal, almost like it had been a formality he expected to fail. "Walter," Sal said, closing the folder, "I don't want to alarm you. But somebody tried to reroute your tax filings to a preparer I've never heard of, using a signature that isn't yours, and somebody drafted power of attorney paperwork that would have given them legal control over your finances. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a plan." I drove home that afternoon with the folder on the passenger seat, and for the second time in a week, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table not drinking a cup of coffee, staring at nothing, feeling the particular cold I'd felt standing in Jenna's backyard. Except this time it wasn't humiliation. It was something closer to fear, not for myself, exactly, but for the shape of what my family had apparently become without my noticing. Comment the word signature below if you've ever caught something that small that turned out to mean something that big. Please note, a few details in this section have been adjusted for privacy and pacing, but the pattern underneath, quiet paperwork moving behind an aging parent's back, is drawn from cases that happen every single day in this country. Now let's keep going, because what I found in the weeks that followed was so much worse than a forged signature. Investigation begins. I did not call Jenna. I did not confront Derek. I have spent a career learning that the moment you show your hand to the person you suspect, whatever chance you had of understanding the full scope of a problem evaporates. So instead, on Sal's recommendation, I called a man named Arthur Klein, an estate and elder law attorney who's practiced out of the same brick building on Delacroix Avenue for almost 40 years. Arthur had drawn up Margaret's and my original wills back in 1998. He remembered us both. Arthur listened to everything without interrupting: the barbecue, Richard Pruitt, the forged change of preparer form, the drafted power of attorney sitting dormant in Sal's file. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk the way careful men do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Walter," he said, "what you described to me is the early architecture of a financial exploitation scheme. I want to be precise with that word because it's a legal term, not an accusation I'm throwing around loosely. Someone is building a set of documents designed to give them control of your assets. The fact that the power of attorney hasn't been notarized yet is actually good news. It means we still have time." "Time for what?" "Time to protect you before they finish." He leaned forward. "I want you to consider bringing in an investigator. Someone who can quietly establish what's actually happening, financially and otherwise, before we take any legal action. If we move too early with incomplete information, we tip our hand and we lose the advantage." That's how I met Denise Okafor. Denise runs a small investigations practice 2 towns over, and Arthur had worked with her on 3 prior elder fraud cases. She's a compact, unhurried woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the specific patience of someone who has spent 2 decades reading people's bank statements for a living. I met her in Arthur's conference room on a Thursday morning, and I told her everything, start to finish, the same way I'd told Arthur. "2 things I need from you before I do anything else," Denise said, writing in a small spiral notebook. "First, do not change your behavior toward Derek by 1 single degree. If he senses anything has shifted, he'll either destroy evidence or accelerate whatever timeline he's working on. Second, I need access to what financial records you do have, your own bank statements, the joint accounts if there are any, anything related to the house." I gave her everything I had. She asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Mr. Hain, do you know the current value of your patent royalty stream?" I told her the honest truth, that I'd never tracked it closely, that the licensing income came in on a schedule managed through a small IP holding entity Margaret and I had set up years ago called Hain Propulsion Holdings LLC, and that Derek had, in fact, offered 18 months earlier to help streamline the paperwork on that entity, an offer I had, at the time, gratefully accepted, because I genuinely believed he was trying to be useful. Denise's face did something careful and controlled. Mr. Hain, I'd like to pull the entity filings on that LLC today, if that's all right with you. It took her 4 days. She called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if she could come to the house instead of talking on the phone, which told me before she said a word that whatever she'd found was worse than paperwork. She sat at my kitchen table, the same chair Margaret used to sit in, though I don't tell people that, and she opened a laptop and turned the screen toward me. 18 months ago, she said, Hain Propulsion Holdings LLC filed an amended operating agreement with the Secretary of State. The filing added a second managing member. She pointed at a name on the screen. Derek Allen Cole. 50% managing control, effective immediately upon filing. I stared at the screen. I never signed anything like that. The filing includes an electronic signature attributed to you, Denise said quietly. Mr. Hain, I compared it against 3 documents you've provided me that you've confirmed are genuinely your signature. It does not match. Whoever filed this either forged your signature outright or used a notary who didn't verify identity properly, which happens more than you'd think when a family member vouches for someone. I sat very still. 50% managing control of the entity that held every patent I'd spent 31 years earning. How much money are we talking about, Denise? She turned the laptop slightly and pulled up a second document, a royalty statement from Holbrook Dynamics itself, one of at least 4 companies licensing my compressor designs. Just from this one licensor, over the trailing 12 months, just over $1.1 million in royalty payments. Across your full patent portfolio and all licensees, based on the filing history I've been able to piece together, I'd estimate your holding company generates somewhere between $3 and $4 million a year. She let that sit. Mr. Hain, since the amended operating agreement was filed, has Derek ever discussed distributions with you? Asked you to sign off on payments? Mentioned the LLC's finances at all? Never once, I said. He told me 18 months ago he'd cleaned up the filing structure so I wouldn't have to worry about the annual paperwork anymore. I thanked him for it. Denise closed the laptop slowly. I think, she said, we need to find out where that money has actually been going. If you're still here, type million in the comments, because that number is exactly where I stopped breathing for a second at my own kitchen table. And I want to pause here and say plainly, some financial figures and document details in this account have been simplified for clarity, but the mechanism, a trusted family member quietly inserting themselves into an aging parent's business entity, is one of the most common forms of elder financial exploitation in the country, and it very rarely looks like a crime while it's happening. It looks like help. The paper trail. It took Denise 11 days to trace the distributions. I want to walk you through what she found the way she walked me through it, because I think the shape of it matters more than any single number. Beginning roughly 16 months earlier, 2 months after the amended operating agreement was filed, quarterly distributions from Hain Propulsion Holdings had begun flowing not into the account Margaret and I had used for decades, but into a second account opened under the LLC's name at a bank I'd never done business with. From there, the money moved in smaller increments into 3 destinations. The first was a personal brokerage account in Derek's name. The second was a mortgage principal reduction payment on a lake house I had never heard of, purchased 11 months earlier under a trust with Derek and Jenna listed as co-beneficiaries, which told me my own daughter's name was attached to at least some part of this, even if her hands were clean of the planning. The third destination was the one that made my chest go tight in a way the others hadn't. Payments, roughly $9,000 every few weeks, going to a company called Windermere Wealth Advisory Group. Denise had already looked into it by the time she showed me. Windermere Wealth Advisory isn't licensed with the state as an investment advisor, she said. It's not registered anywhere as a financial planning firm. It appears to be a single-person consulting operation run out of an office suite by a man named Curtis Rennick. Mr. Hain, I need to tell you something about Curtis Rennick before we go further. 6 years ago, in a different state, he was investigated, never formally charged. The case was dropped for lack of cooperating witnesses, for helping adult children of elderly clients restructure estate documents in ways that heavily favored the adult child. The complaint that triggered the investigation came from an elder services hotline. It never went to trial. But the pattern in that complaint is close enough to what I'm seeing here that I don't think it's a coincidence. I asked her the question I'd been avoiding since she first said Derek's name out loud in relation to my LLC. Is my daughter involved in this? Denise chose her words carefully. Based on what I've found so far, every filing, every account, every payment trail leads back to Derek and to Curtis Rennick. Jenna's name appears exactly once, on the trust for the lake house, as a beneficiary, not a signer, not an initiator. That could mean she genuinely doesn't know the scope of this. It could also mean she's being kept deliberately uninformed so that if this ever surfaces, she has plausible deniability. I can't tell you which yet. I can only tell you what the paper says. I sat with that for a long time after Denise left that night. My daughter's name on a beneficiary line for a house I'd never seen, purchased with money quietly diverted out of the company that held my life's work. I thought about her hand on Derek's shoulder at the barbecue while he called me dead weight. I thought about the fact that she had hugged me a little longer than usual in her driveway that night, the way you hug someone when some part of you already knows something is wrong and you can't yet name it. Arthur Klein and Denise met with me together the following Monday, and Arthur laid out where we stood in the flat, careful language of a man who has delivered hard news to frightened clients for 4 decades. Walter, what we have right now is enough to freeze the entity and file for an emergency accounting. It is not yet enough to prove criminal intent beyond a civil dispute over an LLC agreement. If we move now, Derek's attorney, and men like this always have an attorney on retainer, will argue this was a legitimate business restructuring you approved and later forgot, given your age. We need something that shows intent. Something in his own words. What do you suggest? Arthur looked at Denise. Denise looked back at me. We need to hear him say it, she said. In his own voice, talking about what he's actually planning, not what he's telling you. The Wire. I want to be honest with you about how strange it felt to agree to what happened next. I had spent for years letting my son-in-law drive me to doctor's appointments and file my taxes and, apparently, siphon millions of dollars out of the company that carried my name, and now I was going to sit across a dinner table from him wearing a recording device sewn into my shirt collar, asking him gently leading questions while a small earpiece connected me to a woman in a parked car 2 blocks away. Denise had a contact, a retired detective named Marcus Yude who did private surveillance work on a contract basis and who, it turned out, had also once worked an elder fraud case involving Curtis Rennick's name, though it had never gone anywhere for lack of a cooperating victim willing to wear a wire. I was, apparently, about to become the cooperating victim that case had always been missing. We planned it for a Sunday dinner. Jenna called and invited me over, completely unrelated, completely genuine, the kind of ordinary invitation that made my chest hurt with how normal it still sounded. I said yes. Denise and Marcus fitted me with the device 2 hours before, in the back of Marcus's van parked outside a grocery store 3 blocks from Jenna and Derek's house. Just get him talking about the business, Denise said. Ask him how the licensing income's doing. Ask him about the lake house casually, like you just heard about it secondhand. Let him fill silences. People who are proud of what they've built can't help explaining it. I walked into my daughter's house at 6:30 that evening with a recording device against my sternum and a paper grocery bag of tomatoes from my own garden, because that's what I always brought, and because I needed my hands to be doing something ordinary. Dinner was pleasant for the first 40 minutes. Jenna had made a pot roast, Margaret's old recipe, and for a while I let myself simply be a father at his daughter's table, because some part of me still wanted, desperately, for none of what I'd learned to be true. It was Derek who brought up the lake house himself, which surprised me less than it should have, because Denise had been right, proud men cannot help explaining themselves. "You should see the place we picked up on Castle Lake," he said, refilling his wine glass. "Closed on it back in the spring. Gorgeous dock, boathouse, the whole thing." "I didn't know you two had bought a lake house," I said, keeping my voice light. "That's wonderful. Business must be treating you well." "Business is good," Derek said, and there was something in the way he said it, a small satisfied weight, that told me he wanted to say more. "Better than good, actually. I've had some help managing things on the side." "Financial side?" "Oh?" I said. "Guy named Curtis. Total pro. Helped me restructure some of the," he glanced at Jenna, a flicker, gone almost as fast as it arrived, "some of the family holdings. Made everything a lot more efficient." He looked at me and smiled, and I want you to understand that in that smile I saw nothing. No guilt, no hesitation. Just a man who believed, completely, that he had gotten away with something clean. "Efficient how?" I asked. "Honestly, Walter, no offense, but you never really managed the LLC the way it should have been managed. All that royalty income just sitting there, taxed inefficiently, no real growth strategy. Curtis helped me set up a structure where the income actually works for the family instead of just sitting in an account collecting dust." He took a sip of wine. "You'll thank me eventually. Once you understand it." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs, the particular cold of hearing a man describe stealing from you as a favor he's doing you. "And the lake house," I said carefully. "That came out of the restructuring?" "Some of it," Derek said. Jenna had gone quiet, cutting her pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces without eating any of it, and I watched her face carefully without seeming to watch it at all. "Look, Walter, at some point we need to talk seriously about your long-term care planning. You're 68. Things happen. I've actually had Curtis start drafting some documents, power of attorney, updated trust language, just so everything's clean if anything ever happens to you. I was going to bring it up soon. Glad this came up naturally, actually. Saves me the awkward conversation." "What kind of documents?" I asked, and I heard my own voice hold steady in a way that surprised me, because inside I was standing at the bottom of that same cold place I'd found in Jenna's backyard 6 weeks earlier. "Standard stuff," Derek said, waving a hand. "Full POA. Updated LLC operating agreement making the restructuring permanent. Nothing you need to worry about, Curtis handles it all. You'll just need to sign where he flags it." He smiled again. "Probably next couple weeks. Get it done before year-end for the tax benefits." I set my fork down. "Derek, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Did I ever actually sign the amended operating agreement that gave you managing control of the LLC?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps for seconds. I know because I counted them, the way Denise had told me people always count the silence right before a lie or right before a confession, and this one, I could tell even before he opened his mouth, was going to be a lie. Of course you did, Walter. Last year. Don't you remember? You signed a whole stack of papers at the kitchen table. I don't remember that at all, I said quietly. Derek's smile thinned. Walter, you're 68. You've had a hard couple years since Margaret passed. Nobody's judging you for forgetting some paperwork. He glanced at Jenna. This is honestly part of why we need to get the new POA finalized soon. Things like this, forgetting a whole signing session, that's exactly the kind of thing that worries us. I sat there, wired for sound, watching my son-in-law suggest to my own face that my memory was failing as a way of explaining away a forgery he had almost certainly committed, and I understood, with total clarity, that Arthur Klein had been right. We needed him in his own words, and now, for minutes into dinner, we had them. I looked at Jenna. Sweetheart, I said gently, did you know about this? The restructuring, the lake house, all of it. Jenna's eyes were bright and wet, and she didn't look at Derek when she answered. I knew about the lake house, she said quietly. Derek told me it came from a bonus and some investments. I didn't know about, she gestured vaguely, helplessly, any of what you're describing. Dad, is something wrong? I looked back at Derek, and for the first time all evening, I watched real fear cross his face, because he had just realized, a half-second too late, that his wife had not known what he'd told her she knew, and that the story he'd built for her did not match the story he'd just told me. If you're still with me, comment wire below, because I need to know you're still here before I tell you what happened over the next 2 weeks, because it gets a great deal more serious than a forged signature at a family dinner. Please note, dialogue in this section has been reconstructed from recollection and recording transcripts and condensed for pacing, though the substance is accurate to what actually occurred. 2 days later. Marcus You'd had the recording cleaned up and transcribed within 48 hours. Arthur Klein listened to it twice in his office, taking notes the entire time, and when he finished, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Walter, this is significant, he said. Derek has admitted, on tape, that he told you the current operating agreement was signed by you at a session you have no memory of, when we have strong forensic reason to believe your signature on that filing is forged. He's also admitted, in his own words, that a man named Curtis Rennick is preparing a new power of attorney and updated trust language that he expects you to sign where flagged, without independent counsel of your own reviewing it first. That is a textbook description of an exploitation scheme in progress. He tapped the transcript. But I want to bring in someone else before we go further. Given the dollar amounts involved, and given what Denise found about Rennick's prior history, I think it's time we loop in law enforcement. That's how I met Detective Priscilla Alvarez of the County Financial Crimes Unit, a soft-spoken, exhaustively thorough woman who had, it turned out, encountered Curtis Rennick's name once before, in a complaint filed 18 months earlier by the adult children of a different elderly client, a complaint that had gone nowhere because the elderly client himself, in the confusion of early-stage dementia, had refused to cooperate with investigators, insisting his son-in-law would never hurt him. Mr. Hain, Detective Alvarez told me at our first meeting, what you've brought us is the first case involving Curtis Rennick where the alleged victim is not only willing to cooperate but capable of walking us through the financial architecture himself. That is exceptionally rare, and it matters enormously. She leaned forward. I want to be direct with you about what we're going to ask of you. We believe, based on the recording and the LLC filings, that there's an active plan to have you sign additional documents in the near future, likely the updated power of attorney Derek mentioned. If we can be in a position to witness that signing attempt, or intercept the moment it's presented to you, we have a far stronger case than paperwork alone can give us. You want me to keep pretending, I said. I want you to do exactly what you've been doing, she said. Nothing more, nothing less. Let them come to you. They came to me 9 days later. The waiting. Between the dinner where Derek's lie unraveled in front of his own wife and the Saturday he finally walked into my dining room with Curtis Rennick's portfolio under his arm, there were 9 days I have never fully described to anyone but Arthur Klein, because they were, in some ways, the hardest 9 days of the entire ordeal. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did, and the not knowing sat on my chest like a stone. Denise had warned me this would happen. The waiting is the part nobody prepares you for, she said, sitting across from me in my own kitchen on the 4th of those 9 days, a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. You've done the hard part. Now you just have to keep living an ordinary life while a criminal investigation quietly assembles itself around you, and that is its own kind of exhausting. She was right. I kept my Tuesday lunch with the men from the Retired Engineers Club, the same lunch I'd attended every week for 6 years, and I sat there listening to Harlan Voss complain about his hip replacement and Denny Ostrowski explain, at length, a carburetor rebuild nobody had asked him about, and the entire time some part of my mind was 3 streets away, wondering whether Detective Alvarez's team had finished pulling Curtis Rennick's banking history, wondering whether Derek suspected anything. Wondering whether Jenna was safe in a marriage I now understood to be built on a foundation of lies I hadn't yet fully mapped. On the 6th day, Marcus Yude called me with something that made my hands go cold in a different way than anything before it. Mr. Hain, I want you to know something before it goes any further. We picked up a phone call between Derek and Rennick on a pretext line we'd flagged. Rennick told Derek they needed to move the signing date up. Said, and I'm quoting him directly here, the old man's getting antsy, better to lock the paperwork before he talks to anybody outside the family. Marcus paused. They don't know we're already inside the family, Mr. Hain. They think you're still exactly where you've always been. I sat with that phrase for a long time after Marcus hung up. The old man's getting antsy. As if 4 years of quiet compliance had earned me nothing but a label, the same label Derek had used at the barbecue, dressed up in slightly gentler language because this time it was said behind a closed door instead of in front of 25 guests. On the 8th day, Jenna called me, unrelated to any of it as far as she knew, just to check in the way she always did on Thursdays. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, a recipe she was trying, a book her club was reading, whether I'd finally gotten around to fixing the gutter on the north side of the house. I hung up the phone afterward and sat in the quiet of my kitchen and felt something close to grief for a version of my daughter's life that was about to end without her having any idea it was already over. I had not told her anything yet. Detective Alvarez had asked me directly to hold off, for her own protection as much as the cases, until we had something concrete enough that her reaction couldn't accidentally tip Derek off before the signing. I hate keeping this from her, I told Arthur that same evening. I know, Arthur said. But Walter, you're not keeping something from her to hurt her. You're keeping it from her to protect the one chance we have to actually stop this cleanly. There's a difference, and I think somewhere inside her, she already knows there's a difference, too. By the 9th day, when Derek finally called to arrange Saturday's meeting, I felt something shift in me that I can only describe as readiness. Not eagerness, I want to be honest that no part of me looked forward to what was coming. But readiness, the specific, settled kind that comes after you've spent long enough sitting with a fear that you've finally worn its edges smooth. The signing. Derek called on a Thursday evening and asked if he and Curtis could stop by Saturday afternoon to get some of the year-end paperwork wrapped up. His voice was warm, easy, entirely unbothered, as though the dinner where his own lie had unraveled in front of his wife had never happened. I said, of course, come by any time, and I hung up the phone and called Detective Alvarez immediately. What followed was 4 days of careful, quiet preparation that I still find remarkable to describe. Detective Alvarez arranged for 2 plainclothes officers to be positioned in an unmarked vehicle down the block from my house. Marcus Yude wired my dining room. A small device tucked into the light fixture above the table, another concealed inside a bookshelf, both feeding into a recording unit Denise monitored from her car. Arthur Klein prepared a complete summary packet of everything we'd found: the forged operating agreement, the royalty diversion trail, the Lake House Trust, Curtis Rennick's prior history, ready to hand to Detective Alvarez the moment there was probable cause to act. And on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Derek Cole and Curtis Rennick walked into my dining room carrying a leather portfolio and a stack of documents, and I sat at the head of the table where Margaret used to sit at holidays, and I let them begin. Curtis Rennick was smoother than I expected. 50s, expensive haircut, the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from having done a thing successfully many times before. He spread 3 documents across my table with the practiced motions of a man laying out a sales pitch he had given many times to many frightened, grieving old men. "Mr. Hayne, thank you for making time today," he said. "I want to walk you through everything simply. This first document is an updated durable power of attorney, giving Derek full authority to manage your financial affairs. This second is an amendment finalizing the operating structure of Hayne Propulsion Holdings. And this third is a revised trust designation naming Derek and Jennifer as primary beneficiaries of your estate, superseding any prior designation." "Superseding what prior designation?" I asked. Curtis smiled, unbothered. "Any previous trust language you may have had in place. It simply consolidates everything cleanly." "I have a trust from 1998, I said. "Drafted by my attorney, Arthur Klein, naming my daughter as sole beneficiary of my estate." "This would update that," Curtis said smoothly. "Modernize it. Given your circumstances." "What circumstances are those?" Derek answered this time, and I watched him choose his words with the particular carelessness of a man who believes the outcome is already settled. "Walter, come on. You forgot signing the whole operating agreement last year. You're 68, alone in this big house, no wife to help you keep track of things anymore. It's not an insult. It's just reality. We're trying to protect you before something happens that we can't undo." "Protect me from what?" "From yourself, honestly," Derek said, and there it was again, that same easy, satisfied weight in his voice I'd heard at dinner 9 days earlier. "Look, we've had Dr. Feldman, you remember him, you saw him for your knee last spring, we've had him informally note some memory concerns in your chart. Just precautionary. In case we ever need it for a formal capacity evaluation." I felt the floor of the conversation drop out from under me, because until that exact second, I had not known that a doctor's name had been quietly attached to any of this. "You went to my doctor," I said slowly, "and asked him to document memory concerns I don't have." "We asked him to be observant," Curtis said, still smiling, still perfectly composed. "Mr. Hayne, I want to be clear that everything we're doing here is entirely standard estate planning practice for a man in your position. My position being a man worth several $1 million in patent royalties who you'd like to declare incompetent," I said. The smile finally slipped from Curtis Rennick's face. Derek's jaw went tight. "Walter, that's not. I did not sign the operating agreement giving you managing control of my company," I said, my voice steady, steadier than I expected it to be. "I have never once discussed a power of attorney with you in good faith. You have been diverting royalty income out of an entity I built over 31 years, into a lake house I never knew existed, using the services of a man who was investigated for doing this exact same thing to a different family 6 years ago." I looked at Curtis. "Windmere Wealth Advisory isn't a licensed advisory firm." I checked. The color went out of Curtis Rennick's face in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. "Dad," Jenna's voice came from the hallway, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, having apparently come along without Derek expecting her to hear any of it, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with an understanding I could see arriving in real time. Dad, what is happening? Everything, I said gently. Everything is happening, sweetheart, and I think it's time you heard all of it. I nodded once toward the front window, the signal Detective Alvarez and I had agreed on, and 30 seconds later the front door opened without a knock, and 2 officers stepped into my dining room, and I watched Derek Cole's face go through every stage of understanding a man's face can go through in the space of about 6 seconds. Comment the word "caught" below, because I need to know you made it to this part of the story with me. And I want to remind you gently, this confrontation scene has been reconstructed and condensed for narrative flow from recordings and witness accounts, but every material fact in it, the forged filing, the diverted royalties, the doctor contacted without consent, the undisclosed trust changes, happened. What came after? Derek and Curtis were not arrested that afternoon, though I'll admit some part of me expected the scene to end that dramatically. Detective Alvarez explained, patiently, that financial crimes cases of this scale require the documents themselves as evidence, statements taken properly, and a district attorney's review before charges are filed. What did happen that afternoon was this: the officers collected the 3 documents Curtis had brought, along with his portfolio, as evidence in what was now an active criminal investigation, and Detective Alvarez informed both men, in careful, procedural language, that they were persons of interest in a case involving forgery, fraud, and elder financial exploitation, and that they should expect to be contacted by investigators and should retain counsel. Curtis Rennick left my house that day without saying another word. Derek stood in my front hallway for a long moment afterward, and for the first time in 4 years, I watched him look genuinely, entirely lost. Walter, I can explain. You've explained a great deal already, I said. Every word of it recorded. He looked at Jenna, and something in his face tried, one last time, to find the version of himself that could talk his way out of a room, and failed. Jenna did not go with him when he left. She stayed in my kitchen that night until nearly midnight, going through the parts of the paper trail Denise had assembled that I felt comfortable showing her, and I watched my daughter's understanding of her own marriage rebuild itself, piece by devastating piece, in real time. He told me the lake house came from investments, she said quietly, staring at the trust documents. He told me you'd signed off on the business restructuring. He told me so many things, Dad. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet in a way that broke something in my chest that had been holding steady all day. How long has this been happening? 16 months, I said. Maybe longer. I don't know yet. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I should have asked more questions. I should have. You're not responsible for what he did, I said, and I meant it as fully as I have ever meant anything. You trusted your husband. That's not a failure. That's what marriage is supposed to be. The investigation widens. Over the following 6 weeks, Detective Alvarez's team built out the case far beyond what Denise and I had initially uncovered. It turned out Curtis Rennick's Windmere Wealth Advisory Group had, over the preceding 4 years, worked similar arrangements with at least 3 other elderly clients across 2 counties, always through an adult child or son-in-law, always structured the same way, a quiet takeover of a business entity or trust, followed by a slow, deniable diversion of income, followed by a push toward a capacity evaluation time to make any future objection from the victim look like confused, unreliable. Protest. One of those prior clients, an 81-year-old retired pharmacist named Deloris Vance, had in fact been declared partially incompetent 18 months earlier, based substantially on a chart note from a physician who, investigators discovered, had received referral fees from Curtis Rennick disguised as consulting payments, the same arrangement, it turned out, that Curtis had begun setting up with Dr. Feldman regarding me. Deloise Vance's family had lost access to nearly $600,000 before her son finally intervened, too late to prevent most of the damage, though not too late to send Curtis Rennick to prison, once the case against him was finally strong enough to bring. Detective Alvarez asked me, gently, whether I would be willing to meet Dolores herself before the trial, since the prosecution wanted to establish a pattern across victims and thought it might help both of us to know we weren't standing alone in this. I said yes, and Denise drove me out to a modest ranch house on the other side of the county on a gray Tuesday afternoon, where Dolores' son Michael let us in and introduced me to a small, sharp-eyed woman sitting very upright in a wingback chair, a cardigan buttoned to the throat even though the house was warm. "So you're the other one," she said, before I'd even sat down. There was no self-pity in it. If anything, there was something like relief. "I suppose I am," I said. "They told me I was confused," she said. "My own doctor, a man I'd trusted since before my husband passed, wrote in my chart that I was showing signs of cognitive decline. Do you know what that decline consisted of, Mr. Hain?" I forgot the name of a specialist I'd only seen twice. That was the entire basis for it. One forgotten name, and suddenly I couldn't be trusted to manage the pharmacy my husband and I built from nothing. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly. It took Michael the better part of a year to get that finding overturned. By then, most of what they'd taken was already gone. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Don't be sorry," Dolores said. "Be useful." That's what I told Michael when this all came out. Grief is a luxury. Being useful is a discipline. She studied me for a long moment. "You caught them before they finished with you." "I didn't." "I want you to understand what that means, Mr. Hain. It means when you testify, you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for every one of us who didn't catch it in time." I have thought about that afternoon more than almost any other single conversation in this entire ordeal. I drove home with Denise in near silence, and somewhere around the county line, she said, without looking away from the road, "That's why this work matters to me, Walter. Not the money. Not even the arrests. It's the Dolores Vances of the world, sitting in wingback chairs, telling themselves it was their own fault for forgetting a name. It was not her fault. I want to say that plainly, in case anyone listening tonight has ever been told the same thing about themselves. I want to pause here and tell you something Detective Alvarez told me, because I think about it often. "Mr. Hain," she said, "the reason cases like this rarely get prosecuted isn't that they're rare. It's that the victims are usually too embarrassed, too frightened, or too much in denial about their own family to cooperate the way you have. You gave us the first case against this man we've ever had a real chance of winning. If you're still with me, type the word widens in the comments, because the scope of what these two men had done to other families is a part of this story I think everyone should hear, even though it made my chest hurt to learn it. And I want to note again, some names and specific details of the other victims have been altered to protect their privacy, though the pattern of Rennick's operation is drawn accurately from the case as it was ultimately prosecuted. 6 months later, the trial. Derek Cole was charged with forgery in the second degree, conspiracy to commit fraud, and financial exploitation of an elderly person, a felony carrying significant prison time in our state given the dollar amounts involved. Curtis Rennick faced those same charges across 4 separate victims, plus additional counts related to the referral fee arrangement with Dr. Feldman, who ultimately surrendered his medical license as part of a separate settlement with the state board and was never criminally charged, having cooperated fully once investigators approached him. I testified for the better part of 2 days. I walked the jury through 31 years of patent work, through Margaret's illness and death, through the barbecue where I'd first heard the words dead weight come out of my son-in-law's mouth, through Sal Renner's office and the forged change of preparer form, through Denise Okafor's discovery of the amended operating agreement, through the recorded dinner conversation, through the afternoon Curtis Rennick spread 3 documents across my dining room table and told me, smiling, that it was all standard estate planning practice. The prosecutor played the recording from that dining room table for the jury in its entirety. I watched several of them close their eyes at the moment Derek said, out loud, that they'd contacted my own doctor to informally flag memory concerns I didn't have, in case they ever needed it for a formal capacity evaluation. I watched one juror, an older woman in the second row, put her hand briefly over her mouth. Derek's attorney tried, in cross-examination, to suggest that I was a confused, grieving old man who had misunderstood a legitimate business arrangement, that my own testimony about forgotten paperwork proved the very memory concerns his client had only ever expressed out of genuine worry. "Mr. Hain," Derek's attorney said, "isn't it possible you simply don't remember signing these documents, the way your son-in-law described?" I looked at him steadily. I spent 31 years signing engineering documents where a single forgotten decimal point could ground an aircraft fleet. I know precisely what documents I have and haven't signed. What I don't remember is ever giving my son-in-law permission to steal from me and then use my own doctor to build a case that I was too confused to notice. Jenna testified as well, and I want to tell you, it was the hardest thing I have ever watched my daughter do. She described, in a flat, careful voice, discovering the true scope of her husband's plan the night she stood in my dining room doorway. She described the lake house she'd believed came from a bonus. She described a marriage that had, in hindsight, been built around a slow and deliberate isolation of her father, dressed up the entire time as help. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. Derek Cole was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 11 years, with parole eligibility after 7. Curtis Rennick, given the pattern across for victims and the corrupted physician arrangement, was sentenced to 19 years. Dr. Feldman lost his license permanently and paid a civil settlement that Deloise Vance's family used, in part, to establish a small elder fraud awareness fund in her name. Comment the word verdict below if you made it through the trial with me, because I know that section was heavy, and I appreciate you staying. And once more, courtroom dialogue in this account has been reconstructed from memory and case summaries and condensed for length, though the substance and outcome are accurate to how the case resolved. What it cost, and what it built. I would like to tell you that watching Derek Cole led out of that courtroom in handcuffs felt like victory. It didn't, entirely. It felt like the end of something I had spent for years refusing to see clearly, and the beginning of something much harder, helping my daughter rebuild a life she had believed was solid ground. Jenna filed for divorce 3 weeks after the verdict. She moved back into her childhood bedroom for 4 months while she got her financial footing back, the same bedroom I'd never had the heart to change since she left for college, which turned out, in the end, to matter more than I ever expected it to. She's rebuilt her own consulting business from nearly nothing, since it turned out Derek had quietly drained a good portion of her personal savings as well, funneled into the same lake house trust, and she has told me more than once that watching me refuse to look away from the evidence was the thing that finally gave her permission to stop looking away from her own marriage. Richard Pruitt, Holbrook Dynamics CEO, called me personally the week after the story broke in the local paper. He apologized, somewhat sheepishly, for the awkwardness of that barbecue afternoon, though I told him honestly there was nothing to apologize for. His arrival that day had been the first loose thread in a sweater I badly needed unraveled. Holbrook Dynamics ultimately restructured its licensing agreement directly with Hain Propulsion Holdings, cutting out entirely the layer of confusion Derek had built around it, and Richard now sends me a bottle of decent scotch every year around the anniversary of that barbecue, which strikes me as a strange but not unwelcome tradition. Sal Renner still does my taxes. Arthur Klein rewrote my trust from scratch, this time with 3 independent witnesses and a notary Arthur personally vetted. Denise Okafor and I have coffee every few months, mostly because I've come to genuinely enjoy her company, though she insists it's also because she likes keeping an eye on me, which I don't entirely mind. And Deloise Vance's family reached out to me last spring. Her son had read about the case in the paper and asked if I'd be willing to speak, alongside his mother, at a county-run seminar on elder financial exploitation. I said yes without having to think about it, because I understood, sitting in that folding chair on the day of Jenna's barbecue, exactly what it feels like to be dismissed as dead weight by someone who is, in fact, quietly weighing your life against a spreadsheet. I have spoken at 4 of those seminars now. I intend to keep speaking at them for as long as anyone will have me. What I want you to take from this: if this family story has taught me anything, it is this. The people who exploit the elderly rarely look like strangers. They look like the son-in-law who drives you to your appointments. They look like the doctor you've trusted for 15 years. They look like a smiling man across your dining room table telling you that stealing from you is standard practice. Trust your instincts. When something feels off, a signature that doesn't look quite right, a house you. It matters. It always mattered. Dead weight, it turns out, was never me. If this family story resonated with you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let me know which part hit you hardest, the barbecue, the wire, or the dining room table. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and if you haven't yet, consider subscribing, because these stories need witnesses, and I'd like you to be one of them. Thank you, sincerely, for staying with me through all of it. And one last note before you go: certain names, dialogue, and sequences in this account have been dramatized and adapted for storytelling purposes. If that isn't the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all, take care of yourself, and I hope you find exactly what you came looking for.